Advancing Energy Innovation Conference, and we're going to try to kind of back out a little bit and look at the big picture here. Think about some larger context for clean energy finance. Think about the global context of what's happening here in the United States, specifically the role of government supports in industrial policy in countries around the world, the development of new models for energy innovation finance, and the connections with trade law and international competitiveness. Our fourth panelist, Eric Drummond, is on the way, but we're going to go ahead and start without him. I'll just briefly introduce the other three folks we have up here with us today. Morgan Bazillion is the Deputy Director of the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis, a mouthful. It's a joint initiative between the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Stanford, CU Boulder, Colorado School of Mines, and Colorado State University. He's just joined us here in Colorado. He has Colorado connections. His PhD is from CU. He was previously the special advisor to the Director General of UNIDO on international energy policy, and very focused on sort of the global picture, very relevant to today's conversation. Prior to that, he served as Chief of Cabinet for the Minister of Energy in Ireland, which I suspect would be a pretty fun job to do fun place to do energy policy. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that. Eric Drummond, who's on the way, is a partner at Patton Boggs in Denver, who has deep practice experience in renewable energy, utility regulation, and telecom. He was involved in and represented the Department of Energy in a major financing and development of the largest utility-scale concentrating solar generation plant in the world. So we're looking forward to seeing him when he gets here. Peter Edwards is a partner at Sage Law Group. He's been advising growth stage technology businesses as a lawyer and a venture capital investor for over 30 years. In the late 90s and through 2008, he helped launch the venture capital firm Altera Group LLC, initially as its outside general counsel and later as a partner and principal investor. It's very interesting to see someone who's in the venture capital business actually go back to work at a law firm. So that's a great sign here and a lesson for all of you aspiring lawyers out there. It's so good in the law that he decided to go back. He currently serves as the chair of NREL's Venture Capital Advisory Board. It's really wonderful to have him here. Thank you for joining us, Peter. To his left, Eric Garfinkel is a research fellow here at the law school and an adjunct professor teaching international trade law. He comes to Boulder after a very long and very successful career in Washington. Most recently, he served as chief counsel for China Trade in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Very relevant to the discussion we're going to have here on this panel. Previously, he was the lead U.S. negotiator for anti-dumping and industrial subsidies in the Uruguay round multilateral trade negotiations. He's held numerous positions in government and in the private sector, so we're thrilled that he's moved to Boulder and feel very fortunate to have him here involved with us at the law school. All right, so I'm going to start with kind of some big picture questions about kind of the situation here in the United States, and then I want to move out to talk about the global context and the China, the situation with China in particular. But I'll start with you, Peter. If we step back, and we've had a lot of conversation on the last two panels here, but if we step back and look at the overall landscape for clean energy innovation and deployment here in the United States, what are the key lessons for public and private investment in the sector that we should take away from the last several years? Have we been through, or are we in a teachable moment here in terms of investing in clean energy, and are there lessons that we can take from that?
Yes.
What are they?
Well, I think one of the things that we learned as venture capital investors is that just because you have venture capital at your disposal, and at various times we had $300 million, doesn't mean that you can necessarily follow the venture capital model the way they do in Silicon Valley with biotech companies or software companies or what used to be a good investment, telecommunications companies. Certain industries just have built-in problems. And I think the clean tech industry, to the extent it's relying on manufacturing, as we see from the Solyndra experience, has problems. And we can go into those in a lot of detail. The other lesson that I would throw in is you take a look at bioproduced energy Bioproduced energy is almost always a bad idea from an investment standpoint, unless it's government subsidized.
And why do you say
I know
that?
there may be different opinions. Do you remember, Mr.
We already introduced you, Eric. We're glad you're here. Thanks so much for coming. Yeah.
Glad to be here.
When we first started looking at bio investments, we actually spent an entire day with the chief technology officer of Chevron, and he said, "Stay away from bio. It's no good." And he said, "You know, you can never get close enough to a consistent source of supply to make it work economically." And we tried really, really hard to prove him wrong, and we failed. We found that the risks involved in that kind of enterprise just didn't work. So that's my other lesson learned from that.
So are there particular then segments of the industry that you're more excited about? We had a lot of discussion about this on the last panel, but we'd love to get your views and thoughts on this.
In clean tech investing in general, software.
Yeah, that is consistent with, I think, what we've been talking about for most of the afternoon. So.
Your marginal cost of production is pretty much zero, and especially now with all the cloud-based services coming out.
So, Eric, the question here was stepping back and looking at the overall landscape and thinking about what we've been through over the last several years here. Are there key lessons for both public and private investment in clean tech and clean energy that we should take away here going forward here in the U.S.?
Sure. So my apologies, I got stuck behind
Not a problem.
an accident 2 hours ago.
Thank you.
So, to some extent, William, I think there's a couple of lessons. I mean, one is, I think from the very beginning we needed to align our expectations with what was really going to happen in the marketplace. And that is, while people anticipated that investors would see similar returns to what we had seen with .com, telecom, IT, that was never really going to be the case. It was always going to be more capital intensive. It was always going to be really difficult to maintain the dollars associated with federal policy support and state policy support that would get these really massive, innovative projects still in the ground, up and running, producing energy with greater efficiency and declining costs. So I think there's a little bit of that just never really got baked in, and people's expectations are now starting to match reality. Along with that, I think there is a little bit of reason to be sanguine, and that is the sense that at one point in maybe 2009, we had about $44 billion or so in policy support through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Dollars that were still flowing through the 2005, 2007 Energy Security Act. So we now have had some pretty big projects in place. We're starting to see some declining costs associated with concentrating solar thermal, maybe with high concentrating solar photovoltaic. We're seeing more private investment being associated with projects that are more likely to get a better rate of return quicker. So I think that what that says to me is that having started to match up what we were really going to see in the marketplace with the kinds of projects that could go forward, and seeing that some of these projects will have additional lifespan and market entry in the U.S. by leveraging what's going on overseas. Then it makes me feel like those are some of the lessons we learned, and it doesn't take away from some of the crash and burns that we've seen. But by the same token, some 33 projects or so went forward under the 75 petition loan guaranteeing, a very small fraction of them have not had serious problems.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because you were directly involved in at least one of those, right, in this large concentrating solar Can you tell us a little bit about the experience here and your views on the loan guarantee program as someone who, you're representing DOE, right?
Yes. So I represented the Department of Energy in two 1705 conditional loan guarantee programs. One was a project. One was a project that was a high concentrating solar photovoltaic project. It's the largest high concentrated solar PV project in the world. It went commercial in Alamosa Valley May of this year. And not long after that project, after I got that project, as due diligence counsel, I got a second project, which was municipal solid waste to fill ethanol through a two-stage catalytic conversion process. And it was very novel, and looked like it had real significant benefits that could drop to the bottom line. It was on that second project was on the other side of the Congress's September 30th date in terms of getting it funded, so it's now back in the private market. However, the last I checked, they have cobbled together maybe 150 to 175 million, and I think that project is actually going to go forward with private dollars only. On the PV side, I had a really good experience with that because my project started after Solyndra, because Solyndra was pretty much had gone through much of the process by the time DOE came to us with this high concentrated solar PV project. And the whole time I was working on our project, which is a pretty intensive process, it was so intensive, not just from the legal side, William, but I thought it was so intensive from the side seeking the loan guarantee that I thought I'd never do that. And there were really times when Treasury asked DOE to ask me to get some additional assurances. And in most of the cases, I was able to secure those, but we finally got to a point about 3/4 of the way through the process where I told them, based on the policy and regulatory framework we're working in, this additional 1 or 2 is going to blow this. It just can't be done. It literally could not be done. And they all went back to their huddled in the corner in DC and came back several weeks later and said, okay, if you can get us this, we think we'll go forward. So my perspective, William, was, wow, taxpayers really being protected. You really want this conditional loan guarantee money. Ours was $90.6 million on about $115 million project. And so I felt comfortable with the assurances we were able to get. I felt excited that this particular project was going to go forward, and it's now commercial, and I think that it will have advanced our understanding of what it will mean to try to get high concentrating solar PV at a utility scale. It's a 30 megawatt project, out of the ground, running, furnishing power. And so my overall experience with that was, both on the legal side, very intensive, but as a taxpayer, very positive.
Mm-hmm. So for these big projects, it sounds like there is a role for the loan guarantee program going forward potentially.
I absolutely thought so. And I think that if to some extent there's, we all have to discuss the role of the government behind financing these projects, but I think there were several big projects that would evidence that and support that.
87% of the money went to projects like that, rather than manufacturing enterprises like Solyndra.
Right. Big projects, yeah, interesting. So I want to shift very briefly to what is arguably the biggest change in the landscape over the last 5 years or so, and that's cheap natural gas. Then, if we just assume that we are in an era of cheap, relatively stable natural gas prices going forward, there are obvious implications for all other generation alternatives, but particularly for renewables, it seems to me. And is there a danger, or a serious danger here, that we're going to crowd out renewables in a significant way without really juiced up policy supports? Do we really need to be pushing hard in the next Congress for juiced up policy supports to keep renewables in the game? Or do they need to sort of stand on their own here? And if grid parity is moving further away, you need to chase it even harder. We'll start with you, Peter.
Well,
You know how I have a strong opinion on this.
We want to hear it. That's
Because
what we're here for.
in the technologies
Yeah.
that we invested in when I was an investor, about half of them were renewable energy and half of them had to do with the extractive industries. And I love natural gas. I've got to say, I think natural gas and clean energy go hand in hand. And that's not just because natural gas burns cleaner, and it's not just because it creates fewer greenhouse gases than per BTU, about half the greenhouse gases per BTU as compared to coal. I understand there are environmental issues, and that's why we have environmental regulations. And I understand there are geological issues, and that's why we have geologists, and we do have to pay attention to all those concerns. But why do I like it for clean tech? I like it for clean tech because, in my opinion, the single greatest problem to integrating clean generation into our grid is the intermittency issue. And natural gas right now is the only conventional source of energy that deals with intermittency. You can't fire up and down a nuclear power plant, certainly not. And even coal plants, which theoretically can be turned up and down, it greatly shortens their useful life to do that. So it's not really such a great idea. There is a danger, and like every electric circuit that has a certain level where it just trips the circuit breaker, there is a built-in circuit breaker in natural gas, and that is that when natural gas gets so cheap that it creates an impossible situation for clean tech to compete with intermittent energy sources, intermittent electric power. Pardon me, I didn't mean intermittent, I meant incumbent electric power. When Colorado, for example, has had a hard time attracting certain kinds of renewable energy projects because Colorado's electric power is cheap electric power. You go to a place like Hawaii, they've got all kinds of solar projects and wind projects, certainly per capita, much more so than we do here. Why? Because it's 28 cents a kilowatt hour to buy electric power there. So that's the danger that you face with natural gas.
So yeah, I mean, so I think we can all agree that gas and renewables can work well together, the balancing opportunities with gas. But in a world with cheap natural gas and declining or uncertain policy supports on the renewables side, I guess the danger is the renewables are going to shrivel up and die, and the industry really has a hard time keeping up. Morgan, you may have some thoughts on this. You guys are coming out with a big report on this pretty soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being
you always
here.
do a very impressive job. I'm used to seeing in movies where in law lectures everyone's screaming at each other. So
We'll get to that in a minute.
But if you don't mind,
warming up.
If you don't mind, before I get to that,
Yeah.
just because we have a lot of young, impressionable people in the audience, that
Yes.
I wanted to correct one semantic error and then one factual error. So the semantic error is that the coffee outside says Vienna roast, and I can assure you that in Vienna they don't have coffee like that. And the second thing is that the last panel, the VC guys kept saying how VC guys are the smartest people in the world, and the lads across the street who just won the Nobel Prize in Physics, I'm sure would disagree with that, and so would I. And it brings us to this issue, which is that the United States tends to be overly complex in its policy prescriptions, in my opinion. So we had lawyers up here talking about how great it was that they finished a deal in 6 months with 1,000 pages of legal text. And I assure you that that's not the simplest, most effective way to get renewable PPA in practice, and that's not how it works in Europe. And so there's something about this obsession with complexity. And one of the panelists on the first panel came up with the term legal synthetic tax equity vehicle, which I'm sure is an absolutely brilliant idea. But
He was not a lawyer, though.
Yeah, no.
He's a VC. He's one of the smart VC guys.
Smart guys, yeah. So, you know, where people have seen a lot of renewables go up, you do a pretty simple PPA. You do a spreadsheet that is in Excel. The finance guys are all proud of themselves because they can do a P90 curve on that spreadsheet. And you come up with a number, and then the government backs a PPA for that number. and then you get paid over a certain amount of time, and it works tremendously well. And yes, in Spain they've had some problems with it, in Italy they've had some problems with it, but there are simpler ways than to try to tie our renewable policy to the most complicated tax code in the world. So it's just something to think about. And on the natural gas piece, yeah, I think it's a big problem, obviously. But remember that price that you're quoting, that everyone here is quoting 3.8 or whatever it is today per MMBTU, is unique to the United States of America, right? That's not the price in Europe. That's not the price in Japan. It's not the price in Latin America. It's not the price in Africa. So yes, the United States of America, as one country out of the 200 countries or so on Earth, does have a nice natural gas advantage right now. But at least when we're talking about it, we should create that system boundary that's what we're talking about, the United States, because it is not the case in other places. And yes, of course, if you can run a CCGT plant or OCGT plant with cheap natural gas, you're going to do it. So you need some renewable support, and if you keep making it into legal synthetic tax equity vehicles, you're gonna struggle to get the capacity online.
Any other comments from the panelists on that? Eric, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm not sure about that particular structured financing mechanism, but I think it's. I think if we're looking at a broad view, some of what Morgan is saying, I think, is truly correct, which is we have a very complex system on using our tax code through investment tax credit, production tax credit, cash in lieu of these credits. I mean, all of these kinds of different things, so that's all true. And then I think there's some complexities that are structurally inherent in the system, which is we have a system of laws built up in which the federal government has its regime for how they do big projects, and that doesn't necessarily match up with how the private market does, especially on project financing. And so, you have a little bit of misfit there, and that creates additional inefficiencies. I think the federal government now is really pushing toward understanding where those mismatches are, how to bridge those gaps. And I think that going forward, we'll see some greater efficiency, assuming that we can see additional funding behind it. So I think there's that piece there. The other piece is there was so much of what happened when we deregulated the telecommunications industry that was on the front end pretty darn inefficient, somewhat opaque. We let the incumbents keep the wire. There were a lot of things to work out. The spectrum auctions for the wireless were pretty complex. But we worked those things out, and that drove innovation in telecom in a way that was marvelous. We have devices like this that have more computing power than we'd ever seen in many of our desktops at the time. And yet when we acquired the spectrum, all we could do was tell the FCC when we were asking to move the microwave players off that portion so that we could have the 2.2 to 2.4 gigahertz, was that sometime up the road, we need all this bandwidth because here's what we think might happen. So I think we're in that place there. And I think the last piece I'd say is, and we did this, we really tried to bring this to scale during a period that came close to the Great Depression. So keeping that in mind, I think we have to kind of get our heads around what that means in terms of the complexity of some of our financing, or the difficulty to acquire capital, or what that capital looks like coming into the market, and taking these things to scale.
I mean, I guess I would take a little issue with the idea that it's so complex. The production tax credit is not that complicated, right? And tax credits have been around for a long time. It's more the year-to-year uncertainty that goes with it that makes it difficult as an industry matures. And there are some, partnership structuring issues that come in on the back end, but it brings private investors in a way that a feed-in tariff structure or some other structure may not, which can help with monitoring behavior, and provide some incentives in some ways. In a law school, we of course like complexity because that's full employment for lawyers. So we can come back to that. Peter, I cut you off. Sorry.
Well, I want to add something to what Eric said. I very much agreed with everything that he just said. But he touched on the technology piece and the He touched on the fact that we can compare this to what happened in the early 80s.
Yep.
It was 1984 when the consent decree came down. And look how long it took us to develop the technology to take advantage of the market conditions that spawned. And here we're sitting looking at bringing new sources of energy into our existing technology, and some of that technology is every bit as old as the telecom system was back then. And we shouldn't think that just because we had $787 billion pumped into our economy that we should spend that money and expect the clean tech landscape to change drastically in only 4 years.
Yeah.
It really could take another 50 years, but I'm very optimistic that if you give us the same amount of time that we had to develop telecom technology, energy technology will develop just as well.
Yeah, interesting. Eric, so you've been quiet down there. We want to bring you into the conversation here. As I noted earlier, just this week, the U.S. International Trade Commission issued its final unanimous decision to approve tariffs on solar panels imported from China in response to an action brought by a coalition of solar manufacturers. I've tried to sort of follow this procedurally, and it seems a bit complicated, but it sounds like the tariffs are now going to happen. Earlier this year, the WTO ruled against China on some of its export restrictions for rare earth minerals. This summer, the EU threatened action against China for dumping solar panels. The Chinese government, of course, has been investing many billions of dollars in these sectors. And now, the U.S. and various industrialized countries are complaining, and it's interesting, the U.S. and others used to be in the position of defending their own environmental policies against actions from developing countries. Now it seems like there's been a bit of a shift where the U.S. and others are attacking clean energy policies in China in particular and elsewhere. Are we headed towards a trade war over China's support for clean energy?
So, we are, certainly in a litigation war right now. There are at least 5 different proceedings moving forward. The United States has got a dumping action on solar panels. Europe just filed one that dwarfs ours, covering $26 billion worth of trade. China has filed a case on polysilicon against the United States and Korea. China is also taking the Europeans to the WTO for what's known as an import substitution subsidy, where European companies are offered lower electricity rates in exchange for using local parts and components. So the idea is to give companies an incentive to manufacture within the community. China is making noises about bringing a similar action against naming 5 U.S. states that have similar kinds of import substitution related programs. We filed a case in the WTO on wind subsidies, and this is an area where there's a lot going on. Is it a trade war in the sense that we need to worry about retaliation and counter-retaliation that spirals downward and takes the global economy with it? I don't think so. I think the WTO system is serving the purpose it was intended to serve, and that is to provide a channel through which these matters can be litigated. And that's the process that this is taking. It to some degree, takes some of the uncertainty out of the mix. These cases take a long time to be litigated. In the context of a WTO proceeding, it's about 3 years, so parties have plenty of time, businesses have plenty of time to adjust to the landscape as it might change. If certain subsidies are going to go away by virtue of findings by the WTO, people will have a heads up on that. As far as U.S. or European dumping law or Chinese dumping law is concerned, these are national laws, but they have to conform with WTO rules, and for the most part, countries do follow the rules. So again, this is a very orderly and organized process, and I think it's probably better than a system where we don't have these channels and where we're threatening each other. What's the long-term solution for this? Some suggest that we negotiate a price undertaking, say in solar panels, where China looks at its pricing structure and says, yes, we are selling well below cost because we've got ridiculous overcapacity problems. stimulated by the Chinese government. Billions. I mean, they have dwarfed our subsidies. I mean, as you pointed out, only a small piece of our programs went into manufacturing. They have given credit lines to the top 10 solar companies, the China Development Bank, each in the neighborhood of $5 to $10 billion. So there's unlimited money if you want to be in the solar business. It's gotten to the point now where the banks are beginning to say, wait a minute, this is a bucket with, that's not going to return anything. It's crazy. So there's a real problem. How do we rationalize all this excess global capacity in solar? And so perhaps the Europeans, the United States, and the Chinese need to sit down and figure out how we can price in this area so people can still make a buck and stay in the business. I mean, one of the things that's important to recognize is that China, by virtue of its policy, has in effect determined how our industry is structured, who survives and who doesn't. Ken Zweibel out of GW Solar Institute made a comment the other day that thin film technology has been set back dramatically by China's policies in typical silicon-based solar panels. And so it's having an effect on our research and development. It's having an effect on the structure of our economy. And I don't think we ought to sit idly by and let China dictate what the structure of our industry looks like simply because they're willing to cross-subsidize panels into our market.
So on that, though, I mean, as we heard earlier from Adrian and others, right, if solar DG is the killer app and the zero down solar release is the disruptive technology that's finally going to shake up this sclerotic business model of electric utilities, is it such a bad thing if the Chinese are willing to subsidize, U.S. consumers who want to put solar on their rooftop? Morgan?
That's a great question. I just came from working at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, an industrial development organization to a U.S. mind. If you all closed your eyes and pictured it, you picture a factory in Siberia, because that's how the American mind considers what industrial policy is. But of course, industrial policy is not that. And industrial policy is mostly, the biggest proponents are a guy at Harvard called Denny Roderick and a guy at Oxford. And it's essentially an economic theory about how you regulate and what you do about R&D and where the government sits within that framework, a lot of what we've been talking about today. And it's really interesting because, of course, China operates under an industrial policy. They call it an industrial policy. And, how bad is what they did? And I think is an interesting question, especially to the guys who were sitting up here before who called themselves market guys. I don't really know what that means. That's sort of an American lingo that means, I think it means I like markets that create general equilibrium or something like that. But, if we just relied on the market, of course the WTO would not exist. You would have no legal sanctions for any of those countries. None of those things would be in place. And you would be begging the government to put things up to stop these panels from coming in. But at the same time, remember that what China did, Dr. Xi from the University of New South Wales, where I actually got my PhD, went to China and built one of the greatest PV companies in the world with a fantastic technology that gets 18% efficiency on a beautiful monocrystalline cell. He's now gone, of course, so is his COO, so is his CFO, so is his American guy, because of this problem. But it wasn't all sort of an evil thing, and I think that's part of the discussion in the United States is, after coming back from the United States for so long, it's sort of like rewatching what happened with America and Japan 20, 30 years ago, the sort of bad guys in Asia somewhere beating us at something. And I think while I completely agree with what Eric said, and those seem like very civilized procedures on objectionable grounds, I think we need to temper some of the dialogue around that and see what happened that was good.
Eric, where does it go from here? So the tariffs now go into force here in the U.S. and in Europe, and how does this play out?
So the tariffs will go in place here. Europe's probably 15 months away from doing the same. I think on the subsidy side, we'll have 15% duties on Chinese solar panels and 15% on the subsidy side, 25% on the dumping side. For those of you who don't know the technical definition of dumping, it's either selling below your home market price in an export market or selling below your marginal cost. So we'll have some duties in place. The WTO cases will play out over time. Hopefully governments will get together on this. Another theory is that we do need some kind of a code when it comes to renewables that perhaps makes this area a bit more civilized, recognizing perhaps that we need a peace clause, that if there's a broader objective that we pursue, transition to renewable energy, that we shouldn't be filing trade cases, and that anybody who wants to provide these products at a low cost can do it, and we all ought to benefit.
Now, when you say a code and a peace clause, is that WTO law that
It
you're
can
talking
be,
about there?
well, it
What-
could
what
be,
is that?
it could be an agreement outside the WTO. The idea would be that there would be a suspension or a moratorium on trade actions pending some sort of global agreement on climate
Clean
change.
technology or climate
Yeah, and part of that could be technology transfer and other pieces that sort of take this contentious component out. I would say that China is out of control on this issue, and that does have effects. And so the question is, do we stand by because they pump too many steroids into this sector? Renewables are identified as one of 7 sectors in China's most recent 5-year plan. The plan calls for $1.5 trillion going into 7 sectors. There's virtually unlimited funding for companies that want to get into this, and so they're wrecking any semblance of a market. It's almost a joke to talk about the market and what we can do when you consider that this whole sector is full of government interventions. What's surprising American policymakers is the scale of what China's doing is unlike anything we ever contemplated. I mean, we have rules that say you cannot subsidize. You can't export subsidize, they're prohibited, and you can't use import substitution subsidies. The rest of them are permitted under international rules. You can subsidize so long as you don't cause serious prejudice, adverse effects, to another trading partner. Clearly, China has gone to the point now where everybody's starting to feel the pain. And so the rules never contemplated this kind of case. It may be litigated at some point, pulling together all the evidence and showing that there's a causal link between the subsidies and the injury, the harm to U.S. businesses is a difficult task. But, we're getting into uncharted territory here. Nobody contemplated we see this scale of government intervention.
But these,
Sorry, I want to give Peter and
No, please.
Eric an opportunity to jump in on this.
Well, I'm just thinking, for so many years, we were decrying how expensive solar panels were.
Yeah.
And it is true, it's something of a zero-sum game, but the loss to the American panel manufacturers is a gain to the people that are consumers.
But do we want a domestic solar panel manufacturing industry, and one that may innovate in ways that are different than what China is doing? And I think Eric's point is that we're crushing the opportunity for innovation in the manufacturing and development stage here.
Yeah, R&D is going to move with manufacturing, just like it has in semiconductors and so many sectors. I mean, we used to think that we could design here and let China be our sweatshop, let them build our products. But we're seeing, even GE moved 5 research and development facilities to China in the last couple of years, put $2 billion into R&D in China that could have gone into the United States. Why? Because they're following their manufacturing facilities. So we have to, if we're gonna be in R&D, we need to be in manufacturing.
Eric.
Yeah, I kind of lean toward, my concerns lean toward the last part of this discussion, which is what it may do to undermine innovation entrepreneurs here in the U.S. In large part, I like the idea that we'll have as much market pressure or other pressures to incentivize decreasing costs. On the other hand, I'm of a mind that the kind of manufacturing we want to retain in the U.S. Is never going to really be, can be tied to low wage, low margin manufacturing. We have to think about that part of the manufacturing curve where there are additional apps and engineering and things like that occur on it. That's the part that makes sense that the U.S. tries to do everything it can do in terms of policy to keep in the U.S. and the low margin goes wherever it goes. In the midst of all of this, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is in the process of implementing a renewable energy support regime that will make almost anything else in the world, everything else will pale against it. It will be extremely robust. It will have feed-in tariffs. It will have create a demand of 25 or 54 gigawatts for solar thermal. The country that's sitting on the largest proven supergiant oil field ever discovered by mankind is looking on building a policy and regulatory regime to push the world forward in a way in terms of renewable energy that's going to be second to none until somebody else comes behind it and says ours is going to be even bigger. So I think what that does for me, like personally, is it makes the picture really complex. It doesn't alleviate the concerns that Eric's raising in terms of innovation in solar in that area. But it also says to me that I can advise my clients that there may be a point to pivot and look at what's going on over here while we're working out these issues here, because what that means is that while in some areas it's a little bit of a zero-sum game, in some areas, if you broaden the playing field, then we move where it goes in the world. And you take your technology and let's move it and see if we can get it in this regime here while these issues are being worked out here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a continuum of being parochial or not in this thing. So what you described about picking one part of that landscape, of that industrial landscape, and focusing on it, that's the definition of industrial policy, right? So whether the market guys like that or not, you've just said we're going to do industrial policy. Great. But at the same time, it's a little bit of a slippery slope on the R&D front, right? Because look at how that's working. So in Saudi Arabia, in the kingdom, on top of having that magnificent demand-driven policy for solar, they're building the King Abdullah Research Center that's going to have top-notch solar researchers all over it. And they're not the first, right? So they already did that at the Masdar Institute in the United Arab Emirates, and they're sitting on a ton of gas and oil. And if you take the real cases, in fact, some of the name companies that are on that China thing, so you take Dr. Xi's company, right? So he got his PhD with the famous Martin Green of Australia. He went and got his PhD, he learned this stuff, he learned the physics of it. He became great, he was great, a brilliant guy, and then he left. And then actually Stuart Wenham, who's also one of his teachers, went with him. So he became the chief technology officer of Suntech, right? Because why wouldn't Stuart? He still lived in Sydney, but he flew over to Beijing, right? So I think when you, depending on how protectionist you want to be, whether it's intellectually protectionist or industrial policy protectionist, and maybe that's a strong word in the United States, but there's a lot of subtleties along the way that we'd have to watch out for in doing that, because look at the people we're training at these universities. Look at the people you're training at MIT who are doing the PhDs in physics, not in VC, but in VC too, right? Are they all from America? They're definitely not all from America. In fact, I would guess that the majority is not from America. And so, that intellectual freedom, especially these days with this and all the rest of it, they don't have to live here, right? So I think we're really going to have to watch what we bring into legal courts and not over time.
Yeah, I was going to say that, when we set out to do what we're doing in renewables, we had two objectives in mind. One was promote these technologies so that we can ultimately find ways to address climate change. It's good policy. And we also saw it as a jobs program. That may have been the big mistake, right? Trying to achieve two objectives. So then when companies like Solyndra ran into trouble and Evergreen and other companies were facing Chinese competition, especially in California where prices were falling through the roof, the government was in this awkward position, right, of saying, well, wait a minute, we've subsidized these companies. We obviously believe it's important to help promote manufacturing. Now we're apprised of unfair trade and we're sort of boxed in. How can we not step up and effectively protect the taxpayers' investment?
Well, and do we want to concede, leadership in renewable energy, manufacturing and design to the Chinese and the Saudis? I mean, there are a lot of people in America who'd be very upset to think that the Chinese and the Saudis are basically running the show in renewable energy for the next several decades or however long it is. I'll let you respond.
Let me do one point.
Go ahead. Make your point.
Just the one point is that we haven't talked about politics at all.
Yes.
So at the same time as we're doing all of this, I guarantee you that the United States Department of State is going to places like China, Brazil, South Africa, India, and saying to their governments, why don't you do more in climate change policy and specifically in clean energy policy? So our Department of State is pushing that politically all over the world.
We have 9 programs
Right.
with the Chinese. I mean,
Yeah.
while we're filing all these cases, we are cooperating with them.
So when they go into their 5-year program and say, actually, we really liked your idea, we're going to prioritize it.
With $1.5 trillion. Yeah. So let's talk about government support then for energy R&D. And, you know, we've been doing industrial policy for renewables here in the United States since 1978, PURPA, QFs. We've been doing it for oil and gas. We've been subsidizing oil and gas in various ways through the tax code for a very long time. We've subsidized coal. We had major subsidies for nuclear. You can stack them all up, and the subsidies for renewables are actually significantly lower on an annualized basis than they are for other generation options. There's no such thing as the free market. You heard it first here. They're just competing forms of regulation. Even with sort of, you know, market-based approaches, you still have to have a regulatory framework. We all know that here in the law school. But governments can distort things, and they can create bubbles. They obviously can make strategic and important investments, and we've seen a lot of that in this country that can be very important in terms of driving innovation. It's a question as to whether they have been able to or should, going forward, do that in the energy space, and particularly in the electric utility area. You know, there are a lot of folks out there, and Phil mentioned earlier Bill Gates, and he had an editorial in Science last year on the energy research imperative, and he and various other luminaries have gotten together to talk about the lack of support, both public and private, for energy R&D for decades, and people have been making this point forever. I mean, this has been a perennial complaint here, and you can look at the numbers, right? So compare energy to pharmaceuticals, aerospace, IT, right? Public and private funding for energy R&D is less than 0.5% of total sales in the energy business. If you compare that to pharma, the number's 19%, aerospace, it's 11.5%, computers and electronics, it's 8%. Now, I think Adrian said earlier on the earlier panel that the utility industry invests less in R&D than the pet food industry. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that's what he said, yeah, which will be a nice anecdote for the classroom. So it's hard to do this, right? What's the role of the United States government here? We do have, you know, a complex political economy here in the United States. We have limits on what we can do going forward. We've tried loan guarantees, we've got tax policy, we've got various other instruments that we can do for deployment and scaling up, but we're also thinking about ARPA-E and other kind of more fundamental approaches. And I'd love to just sort of go down the line here and get your thoughts on and let's frame this in the context of advice for a new administration. We'll do it that way. So you've been called in to advise the president here going forward. What would your advice be on the role of the government in supporting energy and the clean energy innovation here in the U.S.? And then we'll open it up for questions.
Well, I technically work for the U.S. government, so
Oh,
I'm
so you
going
can't
to
say
say
anything.
something a little different, which is all day here, and I don't know if it's representative of the discussion in general in the United States or just this kind of group, but there's been an awful lot of utility angst. In other words, almost every speaker in some way or the other has said, oh, utilities are not innovative, they're stopping innovation, not in this panel, but on the 2 previous ones. And I think, you know, maybe that's the case for some US utilities or some part of the market. It's certainly not the case internationally. Mm-hmm. And if you don't rely on the utilities, this transformation doesn't happen, period. So they can transform, they can become something else, but to have that constant sort of utility angst, I think is a false dichotomy. In other words, it's sort of just part of the vocabulary. And so, Mr. President, you should let go of that.
Get over your utility angst.
Yeah.
You know, I can understand why there's some utility angst. I started out my law practice a little over 20 years ago, merging 2 electric utility systems together. They became the 3rd largest investor-owned electric utility holding company in the U.S. And out of that, I became pretty intimate with the generation asset side of the transmission, and especially this holding company owned about 5 or 6 nuclear reactors, both boiling water nuclear reactors and PWRs, and I represented several of those. extremely complex machines. And watched the industry go through several different iterations of what they did with these 102 plants that we had operating, nuclear plants that we had operating. And it's a whole different world, you know. So on the one hand, you know, you have some real inertia with vertically integrated electric utilities. On the other hand, they don't have to remain vertically integrated, and some of them, not all of them that are vertically integrated, are as reticent about moving forward and doing things both on the regulatory and non-regulatory side as others. In Texas, where we deregulated the electric utility industry in 2001 and broke up that vertically integrated sector where the retail part is completely deregulated, the state continued to regulate the transmission, we call the wires, and then the generation kind of went with the wholesale deregulation that had already occurred under PURPA and other regulations. And what we were able to do with that was to take a state that is highly fossil fuel based, and in the early 90s had maybe 190 megawatts of wind spinning, to where now they have about 10,800, 10,900 nameplate capacity of wind spinning, about halfway to 18,500 megawatts of nameplate capacity that they'll have up. In order to support that, they are in the process of building $6.8 billion of high capacity transmission lines. This is privately funded, but I got to work intimately with that, both from my client's perspective and because my best friend was the chairman of the Public Utility Commission during that period of time. And we've remained friends all these years. And so I got to see the government do it right. So, Mr. President, what we want to do is look at those instances where we have done it right. And if we can replicate that, or if we can extrapolate that from that, then that's what we should do. Mm-hmm. And in those instances, I had someone very high from the Department of Interior had a conversation with this person, and this person was just really concerned about whether or not the movement they saw, that they thought the federal government was making in terms of opening up federal lands to renewable energy production, was something that people wanted to take advantage of or understood. And I said, you know, we're at the beginning of it. There's more work that needs to be done, but you're definitely headed in the right direction. And that's going to be important to this overall picture. And I think we look at what we've done, where we want to go, and use the best class scenarios to move the ball forward.
And Texas is a very interesting model, in part because there's no federal jurisdiction over the wholesale market there. I think it'll be interesting to see if the Obama administration looks to Texas and tries to use that as an example for the rest of the country, but your point is very well taken, very well taken. Peter?
I think as a lawyer in private practice, I encourage the government to step up its subsidies of the clean tech industry, step up the loan guarantees, institute more actions in the WTO. But as an investor, as a citizen, a consumer, I would say I know the government has prepared 25, 50, and 100-year energy white papers and statements and policies within the government. I would say, Mr. President, pay attention to some of that stuff, because it is meaningful. You can't solve all the energy issues in 4 years. We have to get consensus in the country with a comprehensive energy policy that's well designed and integrated in all its parts, so that people can depend upon certain things happening in the future and make their intelligent business decisions based upon that. And also it feeds right into the R&D issues as well. I don't care how often you stand back and say, well, the oil and gas companies and the utilities are slow moving and they don't do any R&D investment. Sure, that's true, but it's not going to change. That's part of the landscape, like the flat irons out there. It's just not going to change. You have to recognize. Now, I've been working directly with NREL in their commercialization and deployment since the 90s. And boy, have I learned a lot about technology and development. You know, you don't,
You don't make really new, exciting things happen the way you build a building or the way you build a solar project. There's fundamental technology that has to be developed, and I can assure you, because I know some of these people, they have absolutely no idea what their technology can be used for. So when you say, well, energy only gets 5% of the investment, the fact of the matter is that so much of the technology that requires investment right now doesn't neatly fit into the energy category. I know, for example, I have personal knowledge of a project going on at Caltech, which is really, really sophisticated stuff that involves converting photons that hit a surface into hydrogen, and reducing the hydrogen immediately so that it consumes CO2. It's incredible technology, but it's not energy technology, it's material science. So I'm a big believer in basic investment.
Eric?
So I would advise the president to divert more resources into basic research, stay away from manufacturing. Clearly, where you've got other governments heavily subsidizing, it's just, it may not be smart policy. We do need to be more strategic and step back and ask ourselves, maybe the answer would be to fully tax carbon so that, we fully appreciate the cost to the economy. And once you fully allocate that cost, then there are plenty of incentives for people to pursue renewables, and that will drive everything else. But trying to do this piecemeal, you're subject to political interest group pressure. The policies get distorted in Washington. Government bureaucrats are always a step behind the market, and so I having spent a career in Washington, don't have a lot of faith in Washington's ability to navigate through this. I'd much rather see the market do it in the long run.
So I want to open it up for questions. We will give preference to students. Kelsey, I see your hand up.
So for all the various reasons that you've stated, U.S. utilities have a hard time investing in R&D, thinking that that's a good thing to do. But you also have a lot of countries throughout the world that are doing different and innovative things and are investing in R&D. How do you convince U.S. utilities to use the knowledge that's already out there outside the U.S. to make our system better without having to pump our money into the stuff that they don't want to research?
So can we piggyback on a lot of the investments that are being made in other countries? Is that essentially the question, and bring that into our sort of energy mix? Morgan? You actually used to do the technology group at the UN, right? Can you tell us what your role was there?
Yeah, I used to be the lead negotiator for the European Union at the climate talks on the subject of technology, but sadly the climate talks are sort of absurd in some way. So, I think you have two questions there. Maybe one of the other lads here would be better placed to talk about sort of the R&D bit as it's served, but the utility models itself, the U.S. has this sort of unique, crazy architecture for utilities, regulators, transmission and distribution operators that is not the same as it is in any other country. And so we sort of have our own problem. Now, that being said, a lot of the utilities are now global, so a lot of the big utility companies say own or operate pieces and parts of different parts of the T&D network here. But I'm not sure that the knowledge, they're not great at knowledge sharing. They don't all come together and hug and talk about that stuff very often. But I think you have a different piece too. So the utilities aren't necessarily the ones who are responsible for doing R&D. So that's a different question that I don't really have any answer for.
Yeah.
I'd say you can use a fairly broad brush in creating some incentives. Excel has more wind in its energy generation system than any other investor-owned utility in the U.S., I'm pretty sure.
That's right. No, that's right.
Yeah, and they do so largely because one of the states in which they operate has a 30% RPS standard by which they had to comply. So what that meant was it created fairly significant demand here in Colorado, about 3,800, 4,000 megawatts of demand for wind. And you let the innovators work on the side of building better, more efficient, larger generators and blade design and components for the blades. But the utility has to acquire the finished machine. So I'm not so sure that asking the utility to do the R&D is the approach. Just build the regime for which they need to acquire the finished product and let the innovators and entrepreneurs in the private market do the innovation and have a market to sell their innovation into.
Which is consistent with what was going on in the earlier panel, moving to more of a services model and letting services companies come in and offer their services to the customer and sort of bypass that regulated cost of service structure to the extent possible. I do think there was an element in what I heard in Kelsey's question, though, was are there ways to get countries together to think about technology cooperation and sharing? And my understanding was that the IP issues became rather extreme in some of those discussions where the Chinese were saying, we don't want you to give us machines, we want your IP. And GE and others were saying, we're not giving you the IP for the strategic sector of the 21st century. And so that kind of fell apart. Let's take another question here. Peter.
Thanks for the great discussion up there, and thanks for the nice job moderating. I feel like the U.S. is, I don't know, there's been a push to move to domestic energy since before I was born, and we need to get on top of our energy policy. And we talked a little bit up there about sort of the telecom and how it took years after the sort of deregulation of telecom and sort of, I know that energy is a hard nut to crack, but maybe from each of you, what do you feel like is a piece of that nut that needs to be cracked to sort of open up our energy?
I feel like...
Peter. No, you go ahead, Peter.
I feel like, for those of you that have ever seen the movie The Graduate, where the older guy puts his arm around and say, I've got one word, plastics. Well, my favorite word in answer to that question is microgrids. And for some of you, you know that microgrids are exactly what it sounds like. It's if you think of the electric grid as one great big grid that's got many smaller grids that plug into it, and then yet still smaller grids, sort of like a fractal system. Microgrids would correspond to, let's say, the campus of the University of Colorado, and it would and microgrids, in fact, they're kind of a catchy term today, but microgrids have existed for decades. It's just something that electrical engineers do. What I would like to see happen, what I think people need to focus more on, and I'd love to see the government through regulation encourage this, is to encourage the development of self-sufficient systems so that you can try out new technologies on a small scale. If we were, let's say we came up with a new type of design for a gas turbine, and we think this could revolutionize the American industry, and part of the revolution of it has to do not just with its raw output, but the way it integrates with other sources of supply, and the way it minimizes risk, and the way it plugs into other grids. There's nowhere to test that stuff other than through computer modeling today. What we need is to have many more test beds that are both commercially active and some, of course, pilot projects. And I think that's a good way to, that's one thing.
So you see microgrids as both the opportunity of creating a more distributed ecosystem, but also creating opportunities for demonstration at scale of new technologies.
Well, below scale.
Below scale, but I mean, getting the turbine in there roughly at scale.
Yes.
Not scaling it across the whole system.
And actually looking at the turbine wasn't the best example, because really the better example, instead of a great big old turbine, would be some new type of photovoltaic material, for example, or some kind of software or algorithms for switching electric current that would
or a bunch of electric cars.
Well, there's a fellow up in Fort Collins who's got a design for a neighborhood that incorporates all the standard sources of renewable energy together with neighborhood-sized storage.
Yeah.
And that's some really exciting technology, and the only way it's ever going to be tested and vetted is on a microgrid
Right.
scale.
Interesting. Any other comments on that? The question was to the panel. Another question here, right up here.
Do any of you see any irony in the fact that both China and Saudi Arabia are, promulgating these subsidies with the enormous piles of cash that we've given them for manufacturing things and, the high liquid hydrocarbons that we buy from them? I mean, it seems interesting that we are indirectly funding these subsidies, and I don't know, it seems somehow poetic, but not in a happy way.
Well, the Chinese have been giving us cash, I think, right? They're buying our treasuries and keeping our interest rates. But yes, this is somewhat ironic, it seems to me, if China and Saudi Arabia are going to lead us into the clean energy future, or maybe not. I don't know, any comments from the panel on that?
Oh, why not? If the governments of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and China decide that they want to do that, what will we do now? Tell them that that's a bad idea? So, I think why not? Whoever wants to lead should lead. That's part of the subtlety about industrial policy and trade wars and the rest of it. If they're going to decide to lead and they happen to sit on big resources, as it turns out, America's sitting on huge resources now, right? So they would say the same thing to us. Well, you got Marcellus Shale, so why are you going to bother us with trying to keep our solar manufacturing out of your country? So, I think that's a little more of a complex question. I don't find this necessarily so ironic necessarily.
Or maybe we should be building a domestic manufacturing industry to take advantage of the enormous cheap gas resources that we have
Sure.
and focus our energy there.
Maybe that's where we have a natural competitive advantage.
Right.
But, in solar, for example, China deploys very little of what they produce in China. I mean, that industry was built with an export objective in mind. I mean, they're now exporting 80% of European consumption is coming from China. It was at 0 5 years ago.
Wow.
That's why the Europeans are screaming. This is not a case where China says, let's get into solar so we can fix our own carbon problem. No, they got into it with a mercantilist objective.
I don't find it ironic or sad. I find it fortuitous in many cases. If I have a client here in the U.S. that has developed a technology that is disruptive, but the market here in the U.S. is not quite ready to be able to support that, but there is a market in the world that is, then I think it's good fortune that we can potentially take that technology there, grow it to scale, make money. That money gets repatriated back to the U.S., and we keep going. And when the market here in the U.S. is ready for it, we potentially tested it and take it to scale somewhere else, and we do it here. And I think we're going to see several iterations of that occur, and I'm more happy to see that occur than not.
Peter?
I think that we are experiencing transition to the global economy. It's really just that simple. That's kind of a platitude, but the fact is that with improvements in communications and technology, we've been trying to export peace for the longest time. We have been trying to help democracies get started. They're all, some of them at least, are trading partners, and I think 50 years from now we're going to see a globalized economy where some of these things that you're talking about are levelized, so that for everything that's on that one side, we've got something else on the other side that counterbalances it.
Just to add to that, it's interesting. I think that your question is sort of illustrative of how a lot of people would ask that question. But in Europe, they've been buying Norwegian oil for as long as they've had it. Norway uses none of their oil, or hardly any of their oil. They run on hydro and they're struggling with some gas stuff. But no one seemed to ever ask that question about Norway. I mean, the European Union asks that question sometimes and tries to fight with Norway over tariffs and infrastructure. But, it's been going on there for a long time. So, I don't know, I think these things...
And my German clients, who are solar clients, tend to look at it, this picture not as some sort of zero-sum game, but as this is what we believe we should do. This is what we believe the market will support, and if it's not just supporting it in Germany and in the EU, but it's also supporting it in the U.S., then we'll open up operations there. We'll send some folks over. We'll hire some engineers and some salespeople and installation people, and we'll grow that business there, and it'll employ U.S. citizens. So I support that.
Eric?
Yeah, the last thing I would just say is that clearly this problem calls out for a global solution. I mean, we should be talking, we should be coordinating, we shouldn't be litigating over these issues. There's a big problem that stares us in the face, and that's climate change, and how do we all work together, countries, to solve it.
All hands on deck. So I think on that note, we'll close and give a big round of applause to our third speaker.